Hello and welcome to today's NCTR dialogue on the topic of discussing Canadian pride with nuance. My name is Sandra Bender. I'm the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm very pleased to be joined by today's guests, scholars, educators, and authors Emma Battell Lowman and Adam Barker, who I'll invite to introduce themselves in just a moment. We'll be discussing the recent rise of Canadian patriotism and its impacts on our understanding of reconciliation. As we go, feel free to post comments or questions in the chat on YouTube, and we'll address them. We'll work them in at appropriate points. As ever, please be mindful to keep your words respectful and kind. Before I turn it over to Emma and Adam to introduce themselves, I would like to take a moment to start our session in good ways, for this conversation especially, which is to acknowledge the lands that we are speaking from, which are the ancestral lands of many nations and peoples. The NCTR itself is hosted by the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, the lands of the Anishinaabe, Inninawak, Anishinawak, Dakota, Dene, and the Red River Métis. This province is also a place of many waters, waters which power our province through hydroelectric dams, waters which give us life, waters which give us place to meet, which is why the city of Winnipeg exists. And I'd also like to add to that here in Winnipeg, we drink the water of Shoal Lake, which has been brought to us by an aqueduct built during the time of World War I, while Shoal Lake 40 First Nation has only had a water treatment plant built over 100 years after the aqueduct opened. So positioning ourselves in relation to the land, water, and the peoples who have stewarded them since time immemorial is essential to the work that we do at the NCTR, the work that all three of us in this conversation do, and for that conversation that we're going to have today. So with that, I'd love for the two of you to introduce yourselves. Emma, would you lead us off?
Thanks so much, Sandra. My name is Emma Battell Lowman, she, they, and we. My partner here is Adam Barker, he, him, keeping it with the French, thanks to Sandra's prompt in her name tag. Adam and I are settler Canadians. We are from the overlapping territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples in what is currently called Southern Ontario. Many of our learning started here and in connection with folks of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at Six Nations. And our learnings also continued on the west coast of Canada in Lekwungen, Coasanic, Coasalish, Osanek territories. So we've most recently been living and working in the United Kingdom. But throughout our time, our focus has always been on the sort of relationships and possibilities in decolonizing Canada, reestablishing right relationships between Indigenous, settler, and other peoples. In the territories and teachings we come from, some of the key relational agreements that drive Adam and I in our work, and to which we are also accountable, include the dish with one spoon wampum between Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, which speaks to the need in the Great Lakes areas of living in ways that support the life of others, and sort of give us a set of values to work from. And on that is built the two-row wampum, which talks about how we must work in peace, trust, and friendship between Indigenous and newcomer peoples in order to travel together forever down the river of life. Adam and I are authors, activists, researchers. We wear many hats, but we are driven throughout, I think, by a sort of passionate, compassionate, angry sense of what we could do to make things better in Canada today. Adam.
Thanks, Emma. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Sandra, as well, for inviting us to be part of your discussion series. I just wanted to add that Emma and I try to work from a very multifaceted perspective. We have training between us in political theory, history, sociology, human geography. And as Emma said, this is all deeply personal work to us. We often talk about our family stories, about our own personal experiences, and some of that will likely come up today. So please, everybody who's watching, if you have a question, please do ask it, and we're happy to get into any concept, no matter how big, and any details of our own experiences, no matter how minute.
And as Adam's saying, we work from our experiences and learnings. This includes failure, so we're happy to talk about that. But one last thing, we're really excited to be regenerating our relationship with the National Centre, particularly through Sandra. And we connected with her through her education outreach work, which is excellent. Sign up for her sessions if you've not already gone to one. Adam and I were part of the inaugural research circle at the National Centre in 2016. So we're hoping to continue this relationship into the future because we find ourselves so aligned in their goals and hopes.
Yeah, it's amazing to have this chance to reconnect with you both. It was, yeah, so nice when you reached out after that. Our free monthly webinar is called Residential School History and Legacy 101. So for anyone watching who doesn't know, we do offer that on a monthly basis. So to find out that not only had you seen it, but you were interested in reconnecting and had in fact worked at the same place where I now work, it just felt like a conversation meant to happen. So to start us off, we're having this conversation now, just a little slice ahead of Canada Day. We find ourselves at a current point in Canadian existence, where we've recently come under a very active threat of annexation to our nearest by our nearest neighbor, and so that's led us to see a massive rise of Canadian pride, Canadian patriotism, in a way that Canadians have always been a little quieter about, at least in such an out loud sense. But so that's what's prompted this conversation. Just to lead us off into that convo, I'd just like to talk about nationalism through the Western to Near East lens in general. This is something that we tend to think about as a concept that's always existed. But in truth, in the Western eye, and I say to the Near East because I'm particularly talking about the Ottoman Empire and what happened to it during the 19th century. It was really the rise of nationalism in the 19th century that pulled that empire apart, because national identity wasn't so much a concept. It wasn't the way that people identified themselves. People identified by predominantly, and especially in the Ottoman Empire, by religion. Religion is how tax brackets were classified under the Ottomans, with the preferred religions having better tax rates, and then other religious identities been given different types of taxation. The idea of subgrouping, not by kingdom or empire, but in smaller national identities, is a thing that began to happen really in Europe and parts of Asia, really in the 1800s. We know of Italian culture, say, having been around for a long, long time, but in fact, Italy, as a nation, rather than a kingdom or a cultural identity, a source of music and food and language, all the things that we think of when we think of Italian culture, but as a nation, Italy has only actually been a nation since 1948. It's that recent in terms of that group of people existing in that specific state form. And that's only 1 year ahead of Newfoundland having joined, and Newfoundland and Labrador having joined the Canadian Confederation. So we're talking in similar terms of timeline as far as identifying in that particular way. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of where I want to plant us. Now, yeah, let's go from there. Let's talk about Canadian statehood, Canada as a nation.
Sure. And if I can start by making a bit of a distinction of things that often get blurred together, the idea of a nation and the idea of a state, right, to begin with. So Benedict Anderson, who is a very well-known political theorist and historian, talks about the nation as an imagined community, this idea that all of these people belong together in some way, that those of us who are part of that community have an imagined like us that we can ascribe to all of these other people who are part of our nation. And of course, one of the issues with thinking that way is that when you take that out to kind of its furthest extent, you start to meet people who are not particularly like you. And that either means you have to change your idea of what it means to be like us and what your nation is, or what more often tends to happen, people will try to access the power of the state, the machinery of governance that controls a territory, to enforce a particular idea of what a national subject is, what it means to be a part of this nation. And that's where a lot of, I think the suspicion of nationalism comes from, is the way that it can lend itself to excuses to use power to enforce particular norms of identity, of public behavior, of what it looks like to be a part of this idea of this community, right? And in Canada ourselves, we are already recognized, and I mean at the most basic conservative level, as having more than one nation within this state. The state of Canada goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific to the Arctic, and at the very least contains Canadians and Quebecois, which are recognized as distinct nations. And that's before we even then get into First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, and whether or not those are or should be considered nations within this state, and what that means for our idea of an imagined community. Emma, why don't I throw it over to you?
Yeah, I think Sandra's sort of reminder that, sort of the nation is a fairly recent construction in, human history is a really good one. And, folks who read or enjoy learning about histories might sort of also see, like I do, the sort of shift from empire to nation in terms of, allegiance and required allegiance or sort of personal sort of connection. And we certainly see in 20th century Canada this shift from, being, I'm sure as most of us, if you're born and educated, or at least taught in Canada, about the shift from Canada being, really just a part of the British Empire, not in control of our own international affairs, for example, and the story of gaining independence, particularly through events around the world wars. And so we see I think in our Canadian history in the 20th century, this effort post-World War II to figure out, who are we? What does it mean to be a Canadian? What does that look like? And this was particularly evident around the sort of centennial of the creation of the Dominion of Canada in 1967. This sort of seeking and searching for what does it mean? What symbols are Canadian? What does this look like? And certainly, I think a lot of what I've inherited as a person, raised in these lands, is a sense of what is this identity in the post-World War II geopolitical situation. The myths and stories about Canada as a peacemaker, as the good guy, and as a nation defined by our pristine northern lands and our niceness and our many appropriated Indigenous symbols and technologies. I'm looking at the maple leaf because of maple syrup, the Inukshuk, the canoe, and these are symbols still on the world stage that we use to sort of demonstrate who we are and who we're not.
Well, on the topic of who we're not, I've lived in the U.S. a couple of different times, and yeah, being asked, when confronted with that notion of Canada is pretty much the same as the U.S., and now again, like certain people saying things like this imaginary line. It's true, that is an imaginary line between the U.S. and Canada, but saying that we're basically all the same, so we should all be the same. And me, as early as 1999, the first time I lived in the U.S., saying no, Canadians are different, and we're mostly different in that we are not you. That so much of Canadian identity either relies on borrowed symbology, borrowed pieces of culture from the First Peoples, or that we identify as being somehow not American. But putting a finer wording to what that identity even is has always been a little nebulous, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that part of that comes from the fact that going back to the idea of an imagined community, Canada was made in fits and starts and by all different means over the course of quite a long period of time. And the communities of people who comprise this country are different regionally. They're been quite different across time. We don't have a consistent sense of what is our mission in the world? What is it we're supposed to do? And there have been times where Canada and the United States could be seen quite legitimately as being very, very similar. There was a period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where Canada and the United States were written about as their politics being based on the narcissism of petty difference. Essentially, because they weren't particularly different, they got quite antagonistic with each other. And thinking almost of siblings, right? Not being exactly the same, but often having a lot in common, and that being one of the things where there's a constant struggle to differentiate ourselves from each other. And one of the key things that always ends up holding Canadians as differentiating themselves as, well, not American, is that American, depending on how you want to position it, confidence, or if you want to look at it a different way, chauvinism, that is the grounding of their very open imperial ambitions through most of American history. That's a big part of the American character, this sense that the American Revolution was the best thing to happen for humanity and everybody else should get on board. And one of the difficulties when we discuss Canadian nationalism is recognizing that we don't do that. There are definitely differences in the way that we discuss ourselves and think about ourselves and how our community works. But there's also a great deal of similarity in how we've gone about claiming territory, in how we've gone about constructing our state, in how we continue to relate to Indigenous nations, those sorts of things. Even our international policies are greatly and deeply linked. And so we need to simultaneously be able to hold in our heads that there are differences, but that the overlap is significant and that it comes from some very, very common roots in terms of our relationships to land and place and the development of our people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's such a good reminder, too, that our nation building happened in fits and starts. Emma, I was so glad that you referred to the wampum belt, the dish with one spoon, that those agreements that we now call treaty have been the foundation of how Canada has essentially established itself as being legitimate holders of territory. Yeah, it's something that I've often included in educational presentations as part of my own land acknowledgement. That I'll frankly say that these treaty relationships are actually the only thing that give Canada as a nation any legitimacy. And where we see defensiveness from non-Indigenous Canadians coming from is, I think, pretty obviously a fear of that legitimacy being threatened.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that we as Canada, and we're the three of us are all speaking from that settler perspective, have to constantly defend our right to exist. That there's some feeling of that if we honor Indigenous land claims, or movements like land back, like the duty to consult for Indigenous peoples to have free, prior, and informed consent, is all a threat somehow to the nation of Canada's existence, economic well-being, all of that stuff.
And I think it's a good point, linking it not just existence, but economic well-being. I think that's something Adam wants to come back to maybe a little later in the conversation. I'm sort of struck by in this that fear, so the settler fear that, if the power sort of situation was inverted, that Indigenous peoples would do unto settler and newcomer peoples what we have done to them. And I believe this is something that Richard Day, who's a sociologist active out of Kingston, Ontario, I believe, he's still there, and indeed Albert Memmi wrote about in The Colonizer and the Colonized. So this fear, the inversion of the what would happen. And in many ways, this fear gets sort of blown into huge proportions. It's not just that we might be displaced, but that a little bit of our privilege, a little bit of our comfort might get impacted. And that starts to get taken as, a deep affront. There is an element of that fear of being displaced, I think is maybe worth sort of bringing in here. So I said Adam and I have been living and working in the United Kingdom for quite some time, and our accents made us stand out. Also, our general sort of not Englishness, which manifested in many ways, stood out. And so people would initiate conversations with us about Canada. And for a lot of the folks that we encountered, we were living in Leicester, which is in the Midlands of the United Kingdom. It's a place that has become home to folks from all around the world, but particularly folks pushed out of Uganda in the 70s, people from Poland post-World War II, and increasingly folks from the Indian subcontinent. And so the folks that we were encountering would fairly often talk about Canada as a place that had been a place of refuge, of safety, for their families, their extended families. And if we talked about, the challenges with Canada, the problems that we see, the things that we know about, that would often sort of hit people in a really upsetting way. Mm-hmm. So it's another way of this kind of, how do we try and reach people with these multiple stories and experiences of what it means to be Canadian and what that potential threat of redisplacement can look like. And I think that, considering our makeup in settler society in Canada, that's something worth paying attention to. But settler fear is something that disciplines us quite quickly out of engaging in what we might call meaningful reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I would say alongside that fear, we often get the manifestation of anger as well. And this is, a key thing that is part of assertions of nationalism is when we feel that something is threatening our sense of who we are. Somebody is telling us the stories that we tell about ourselves are not true, that or that they don't count, that they don't matter. That is something that generates pushback, and that can be manifested both as the elbows up pushback we've seen against Trumpian annexation threats, but it also happens as we've seen any number of times when we tell stories that make people feel that their own belonging on these lands is illegitimate because of it counteracts the story of us as these peacemakers who legitimately claimed land through treaty. And part of this is a question of scale, because when we talk about nations and nation building and what the state did and what the crown is responsible for and those sorts of things, often that sits juxtaposed to people's personal experiences and their family stories. So both my family and Emma's family came to these lands, came to Turtle Island and the places where we sit now within the 20th century. And, so for my family, just briefly, it was post-World War II. My father's family came from England. The economy there was smashed. They were a poor family. They came over here looking for opportunity, and they found it. And lots of people have a story like that. And when we say, look, a lot of Canada's claims to land are illegitimate, they say, well, should my family not have done that? Should my family just have starved to death in England or wherever we came from? And It's obviously no. I'm very happy that my grandparents came here, and I feel very lucky to have grown up in this country. And at the same time, we have to be able to hold in our heads that individual people making those decisions in the context they were in doesn't excuse not telling the truth about the larger national story. And the anger that we see and the fear that Emma talked about is often a response to feeling like the rug has been pulled out from under us, because what we know about ourselves and our positioning and what we're being told about the country and how it came to be don't fit together.
Right. Exactly. And it is hard. It is genuinely hard to hold simultaneous truths in our hearts and minds and spirits about this country. My family has the same story as many newcomer families, first generation newcomers do. That is the Canadian story. If we're not Indigenous, that at some point, whether it's in our generation or 10 back, that we came from somewhere else. for reasons. These days, we're not, people aren't typically coming to Canada to conquer it. People are coming to look for better opportunities. They're coming from places of emergency, war zones, refugee camps, places where there is no work, no hope. I grew up with that same narrative of gratitude in my own family. In my family was all of my grandparents who came as a mix of refugees and immigrants from war zones, from the post-Irish potato famine depression, respectively. I have a great grandparent who was Roma and had himself emigrated to Germany to live inside, to not have that traveler lifestyle anymore. My German grandparents came fleeing the Third Reich, having to serve it. And they had on principle, regardless of who was running or what their platform was, on principle, they always voted Liberal in federal elections because it was a Liberal Party in power that accepted them. And that kind of claim, that gratitude, is what I think is part of what makes Canadians so fiercely proud of Canada, as well as you mentioned, our international reputation for peacekeeping and being the good guys on the world stage.
And this good guys thing, we've been mentioning it, but let's make sure we orally footnote Paulette Regan's work on the peacemaker myth.
Yes.
So Paulette's book, if you haven't read it, Unsettling the Settler Within, really excellent, UBC Press 2010. We don't get any kickbacks for this. It's really
no
good
royalties for us.
So this idea that Canada, in this story, that Canada is the good guys, right? We're like the Goldilocks, right? We're not as cool as the Brits. I mean, not cool in a good way. We're not as hot as the Americans. We're just right. And these stories, let's make sure we link this up to stories about Canada being this land of the free for enslaved people and Black folks in America, right? And that important 18th and 19th century story, which, as has been demonstrated time and again, I'm reminded of Alpha Cooper's work, her great book, The Hanging of Angelique, go buy that too, or borrow it from your local library. Canada did have chattel slavery, and it did have, sort of highly racialized treatment of Black folks for a very long time. In many ways, that continues. So these stories we have, it's like the Americans, they had the Indian Wars, but in Canada / Britain, we gave the gift of civilization. So these are the things on which we're founded. I'm minded of my father sharing the story just a couple of weeks ago. So he emigrated in the 70s to Canada, and when he sort of talked about, having been born and raised just post World War II, and living through Britain transforming from an empire to a nation state. And really kind of starting to feel the baggage and the difficulties of that as a person living in that country, and saying, well, I came to Canada because I thought that we didn't have that here, that wasn't going to be the issue. It's the true north, strong and free. And these are the kinds of stories that we tell again and again, that Canada doesn't have those problematic dynamics and histories that other places do. And it is very possible that by comparison with some other places, there might be a few less problems, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. And the ways that these things are often hidden from newcomers, they're not part of the stories we tell. That's not how we're socializing new arrivals. There's a problem there.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really important point to circle back around to something Emma mentioned before, which is the economic aspect of Canada and how and why it exists. And we paper over, like Emma suggested, the existence of chattel slavery, the existence of all kinds of unfree labor. And we instead tell the story of the brave pioneers making the country through hard work and effort, ignoring that the vast majority of work on the land was not being done by those people. It was being done by people who they controlled. We had recent comments bemoaning the fact that, well, you couldn't get the Trans-Canada Railway built now. Well, no, you couldn't, and frankly, shouldn't have done it the way that it was, because every mile of that track is soaked in the blood of people's, primarily from China, but other places as well, whose lives were sacrificed for the development of the infrastructure of this nation so that it could economically profit. And that's where things roll downhill, so that if my family, somebody else's family is coming here in order to make a better life, they're not necessarily doing it aware of the fact that the wealth of the country comes from these oppressions and these impositions and these extractions. It's also very germane to the fact right now that our current federal government, elected as a pushback against, primarily against Trumpian annexation threats, has taken a policy position of essentially indistinguishable from Trump's drill baby drill. We're going to do energy extraction programs, whatever the cost. And Carney's saying, we shouldn't ask if we can do these projects, but simply how. And that implies that we're assuming consent. We're assuming that consultation is just simply a way of getting to the thing that we want in the end anyway. And that is, in a way, what has always happened in this country and what we've never talked about up front. And it is something that affects all of us to the degree that we benefit from those things.
Oh, absolutely. It's a standard, as a non-Indigenous person working in Indigenous space with an Indigenous organization, it's my personal policy to do my best to root my ways of doing and being in the teachings of our elders, which means as a woman identifying person, that acknowledging the water is part of my responsibility, that caring for water, defending water is part of my responsibility as a woman human. And so I talk about hydro dams. And that was sort of the first piece of my, grown-up advocacy work, was working around justice issues to do with hydroelectric dams and compensation for the, on a human scale, irreparable damage caused by those dams. But meanwhile, we as a country keep buying this myth that hydro is clean energy, hydro is environmentally safe, but we see that happening over and over and over again. And now, in Ontario, Bill 5 was just passed, which gives the Ontario government, as I understand it, the right to bypass the legal duty to consent Indigenous communities about land development.
Yeah,
as though it's just a nice thing to do if you have the time and you feel like it.
And that even that bill is just simply softening something that already existed to a certain extent in law, in that Aboriginal title, as it had been decided in the Supreme Courts and articulated at that highest level of the Canadian legal system, always said that essentially the state could push it aside if doing so was in the national interest. And this was designed as almost like this emergency release valve. Like, okay, there's a meteor coming towards the country that's going to destroy it unless we happen to get this dam built, right? Then we're just going to build the dam. But what has now become the national interest is this idea that we need to secure our energy future separate from the United States. We need to, reconfigure our economy now that with the ending of the post-World War II sort of global political and economic order. And therefore, just about anything that Canada sees as a positive development economically can be articulated as being in the national order. And so something like Bill C-5 is really just formalizing what had already existed. And this is what a lot of Canadians don't really understand, is how much of the simple fact that the duty to consult exists at all in practice is because Indigenous peoples and nations have fought to hold the state to account over many, many years. It's not something benevolent. It's not something that is done out of the good graces of a peacemaker government. It's something that Canada's arm had to be twisted over decades to do.
Yes, exactly. Let us not forget also that the free, prior, and informed consent principle is so firmly in many of the articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's now entrenched in Canadian law through Bill C-15, which was passed into law in just 2021. Let's not forget that we're one of the 4 nations, Canada, that voted against UNDRIP at the table with the UN. We later signed it and now have a law that says that we are legally bound to respect it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you sort of emphasized Canada sort of hanging back, and the 4 nation states who were refusing to sign, former white settler dominions of the British Empire, who have acted throughout, I think 20th century history as well to stymie these kinds of efforts. And then the version that was signed had to be further watered down so that there would be that these countries would eventually sign. And, it's been taken as more of a sort of, I think Canada's approach to the declaration has more been like, okay, vibes, not actually, implementing the serious nature of what's in these documents, but this ties us back to post-World War II sort of decolonization, where, they enacted what we call the saltwater thesis to say, okay, empires have to divest themselves of their colonies and return to local rule. But what do countries like, the US and ours going to get in there? But only if they're overseas. So we have these mechanisms over time. Like what we're talking about today is, it's not new. I'm minded as well. Like, quite famous example in Canadian history is that, mainland British Columbia gets claimed by the British Crown and then gets folded into Dominion of Canada in 1871 because of an American annexation threat from miners coming up from the California gold fields and self-governing in 1858, where the British Crown went, oh my God, and then without any kind of consultation, just declared what is mainland British Columbia to be a colony, riding roughshod over Indigenous protocols, legal systems, rights, and even former agreements between the Crown and Native peoples. So there seems to be a very eerie parallel to what's happening today.
Yeah.
If I may, I just wanted to share a quote from a very fine book, which my background is wanting to blur. This happens to have been written by the two of you, Settler Identity and Colonialism, particularly the second edition, which I note is recent enough to be able to talk about things like the recent so-called Freedom Convoy. If I may just read a sentence here. Canada as a nation and a state is dependent on the land taken from Indigenous nations, land that those nations still contest, and colonialism is about the need to secure those lands and justify the legitimacy of those claims at all costs. And yet, this is an amazing book. I'm going to put a link. Since you were kind enough to shout out our educational series, it seems only fair to return the favor. Settler Identity and Colonialism, such a good read. I'll just leave that there for a minute. But the fact that, most of mainland BC is not covered by treaty agreements, and then how Canadians even understand those treaty agreements in a different light than the way that we typically understand treaty agreements between Canada and nations outside of Canada's borders, that those are somehow legitimate and legally binding per the Vienna Convention on Treaty, but that we don't have that same respect or understanding of the legitimacy and the legally binding nature of the treaties signed within the borders of Canada on Turtle Island. And that we have, in fact, run roughshod over what has always been and still is unceded territory.
Yeah, and it comes back to that the importance of differentiating between a state and a nation, because what Emma was talking about with that claim to British Columbia was the British Empire setting up the mechanism of a state, which then later gets filled in. Right? We tend to think about nations building their own governance structure and building up this state apparatus around them, but in our case, it didn't work that way. It was frequently assertions of claiming territory that there was very little reason to claim it. And I mean, whether it's the case of British Columbia, where there's literally no treaties, or whether it's the signing of treaties and then simply willfully misinterpreting them, the claim to territory by the state is really what's fundamentally at question here, not whether or not individual people or communities feel an attachment to that place. I mean, I've lived in British Columbia. It's a beautiful place. If I could choose to live in one place just simply based on the quality of life and the environment, it would be out on the West Coast. My feeling of attachment to that place is legitimate, but the claim of the state to that place is not. And when we once again look at the machinery of the state, what structures it within our own constitution, within Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, it says Canada recognizes and affirms Aboriginal titles and treaties. But many of the treaties that it was their existence that led to the ability of Canada to come into being, such as the two-row, are not part of that conversation at all, because it would require the state being structured in a very different way than it is. As a nation of people, we're capable of doing that. We could have that conversation, but it requires some very hard and difficult decisions about what we would want our governance to look like, how we would talk about ourselves as a people.
And I think in the terms of those treaties and how we treat them, I'm sort of minded of like a fundamental rupture around this, in that my understanding of Indigenous treaty is relational, and it's about relationships that are ongoing, and relationships for purposes of life ongoing, and settler, colonial, crown treaties as being seen as transactional. So you do this, we get this done, and this doesn't go forward. There's not a future looking piece. And that ties in, of course, with one of the key goals of settler colonialism, which is the elimination of Indigenous peoples as peoples. So as collectives, nations, and communities exert, sort of enacting their own politics, economies, sort of social and cultural relations. And alongside the treaty making of the Crown and then the Canadian state in the end of the 19th and into the 20th centuries, I mean, let's remember the policy broadly stated is one of genocide. We can call it cultural genocide. We look at physical genocide. The work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission coming off the work of so many survivors advocating, pushing, and contesting in the courts for so long has made it unavoidable, I think, for Canadians to not have a sense of that. And that, the sort of finding of cultural genocide in the practice of those schools, aside from the levels of abuse and mistreatment, but that the intention of that system was to do that. If you follow the history, we follow from residential schools into incarcerative hospitals, into the child welfare system. And so these are things that shapeshift through the 20th century and are still premised on this idea that Indigenous peoples aren't going to be around. Indeed, the reserve systems were created in this country as a temporary measure. The government never intended those to be permanent. So I think that really colors how treaties have been understood. And one of the challenges, one of the things we need to address, particularly as settler folks, and from within our own families, communities, governments, and institutions, to change and to correct that way of understanding these agreements and relationships.
Well, I'm so happy that you naturally segued our conversation into the TRC, and that you brought up the language of relationship, because the colonial way of thinking is so transactional. There's that very prevalent, racist viewpoint that what Indigenous peoples want to see as far as reconciliation goes is money and money alone. When we have to consider that the whole premise of giving money in annuities granted by the historic numbered treaties in place of the right to sustain life from the land in traditional ways. That was from the colonial perspective, that was our thing. That was our idea. That the TRC's given definition of reconciliation actually boils down to respectful relationships. And sometimes I've even argued that I don't know if we can talk about reconciliation, because I don't know that I agree that we had conciliation in the first place. That from the point beyond the two-row wampum belt, that understanding didn't exist on the colonizing side of nation-to-nation respectful relationships. And you're right. I've often also argued against the term cultural genocide. I think a better expression of that is genocide committed through cultural methodology. It's absolutely genocide. It's still a way of eliminating a whole people. If you assimilate a people successfully and make them forget who they ever were, they essentially don't exist anymore. It's no less a genocide than gas chambers.
Yeah. Emma mentioned the concept of elimination, which comes to us from settler colonial scholar Patrick Wolfe, who talked about the as Emma put it, the elimination as peoples able to functionally control their own government, to assert an autonomy, those sorts of things. And that form of elimination includes at times kinds of genocide, but it also exceeds it. That's something we do write about in the book, that elimination is something that is it's a whole vast suite of techniques and approaches, from the most violent to the most subtle. And things like what Yellow Knives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard talks about in the context of the politics of recognition and the creation of Indigenous peoples as essentially a minority within Canada. Indigenous - Canadian as this sort of subset of being Canadian, in the same way that I'm British Canadian, or somebody else is Italian Canadian. Getting back to this nationalism, that what makes us all the same is the Canadian part, and all the rest of it is kind of secondary. Whereas in many ways, what we've seen from any number of discussions, whether it's the TRC, whether it was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, whether it's been the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, is that the harms that are done are going to continue to be done so long as Indigenous people do not have the ability to make decisions for themselves as peoples and as nations. And that's what we're struggling with in these discussions of nationalism right now. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going to diverge slightly from that point, because I wanted to go back to something you mentioned before, Sandra, which is we do write about the trucker convoy as this assertion of a kind of Canadian nationalism that's happened relatively recently, a kind that I find particularly disturbing, and that I don't recognize myself in the demands, in the anti-vaccination stance, in the closed borders stance. I don't recognize that, but I would never go so far as to say that those people are not Canadian. In fact, their expression of Canadian nationalism is in some ways closer to some of the traditions that built this country than what I think of myself as, right? And so we have to take all of these things into account.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you also talked about how in the eyes of many who didn't resonate with that particular movement, it was seen as a taking over. That's not the word I'm looking for, but an appropriation of the Canadian flag to mean something else.
Yeah.
And I've heard people since Trump took office and started talking about annexing Canada into the US, the whole 51st state thing, and the response, the elbows up movement. I've heard people saying, yay, now we can actually fly a Canadian flag without being mistaken for something else. And doubling down on the need to develop economic initiatives that are independent from the US. That essentially Canada's nationhood has, from its very start, been claiming a race to claim Indigenous territory and benefit from it before the US could. Whether it was still back in the time of the 13 colonies, you guys talk about that in your book too. It really is a very good book. And they're not paying me to say this, I promise. It was my idea to talk about their book. But that has been the predominant leading edge of how Canada has established itself nation-wise, economically, and that's a lot of what's driving the current swell of patriotism we see.
Mm-hmm. And I think that swell of patriotism, like you said, it's so evident. The Canadians there's so many flags up. We're coming up towards Canada Day, and I'm anticipating that being a bit of a challenging moment in terms of people celebrating. But, me always probably want to ask, but what are you celebrating?
Right.
How are we getting to that point? Where is the work that's happened on, regenerating just relationships with Indigenous peoples? Where are those considerations? So in some ways, the patriotism that's coming out now is kind of an old school one. Seems to be forgetting, again, the work and the progress that seemed to be made. Again, Adam and I, spent some time living away and coming back periodically, and there were changes that we've seen. It's not always going, we're not always going as deep as the roots, but we're seeing some surface changes in how people are, sort of the fact of land acknowledgements happening in more places. These are small signs that maybe there's been some movement. And I think this, how can we hold more than one thing in our hands? Comes back to what I think you're saying, Sandra, about reconciliation. And even that term, that comes just kind of from accounting in a way, when we reconcile our books and we literally draw the line, zero it out, we draw the line, it's done. And this idea that, skipping over the truth entirely of the commission and getting to the reconciliation, that then we'll be able to put the rest of this bad stuff in our past. And Canada can just go forward as the shiny, brilliant, bright, true north, strong and free that maybe a lot of us wish it was. And some of us believe that it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's very hard on a day like Canada Day to hold a flag and sort of say okay, but what I'm proud of is universal healthcare. I'm not proud of the residential school system or the thousands of people who've been forcibly disappeared or murdered. I'm not proud of the all the things that we justifiably criticize in our work as educators who educate our own on the history and continuing legacy of the way our nation has been built and at what cost to specifically our Indigenous relatives.
And I think that part of it is the issue of pride, right? I can be grateful to have been born and raised in this country, and I can be very thankful that we have universal health care. But I also have to be aware of the fact that, well, part of what pays for universal health care is the land and territory and the resources, all of which, have been stolen, are being stolen, that a consequence of all of that is the ongoing elimination. I cannot want to be part of what the United States is right now. And believe me, I don't. I can make an argument that in material reality, being part of the United States would expand suffering for a lot of people in this country without losing sight of the fact that we also should be doing a lot better than we are in that regard, right? We don't have to break things down into a binary that just because we don't want to be that for very real, justifiable, definable reasons, that in any way makes what we currently are and what we currently have idyllic or utopian or above reproach. And unfortunately, that kind of messiness, that kind of shades of gray, that understanding that we sit on spectrums, that is harder to rally people around than waving a flag and saying, yay, we are Canadian. And that, I think, is a challenge for those of us who work in kinds of education, who work in forms of public engagement, is to find ways to get people to be passionate about the gray area.
Yeah, that part. But even just talking about public healthcare within the colonial system, it has to be acknowledged that that's not a right that's extended to the same extent to remote, predominantly Indigenous communities either.
Or has been weaponized against those communities at times. We can talk about the sterilization of Indigenous women. We can talk about the use of health as something that was an excuse to abduct children, to institutionalize people in sanatoriums, right? Like it's not an unequivocal universal good. That doesn't mean it's bad, but it means that there's shades of gray.
And this is where that yearning for simple stories is. I mean, it's simple stories that are being used in this kind of overblown rhetoric in the media and, from our national leaders, I think, this It's got to be one thing or the other. You're with us or against us.
Right.
It's, this country is great or it's in ruins and falling apart. And
Mhm.
we yearn for simple stories sometimes because they're easy, because they're powerful and make us feel a certain way. But chances are, if you're being told a simple story, you're not being told the whole truth.
Yeah, that election commercial with Mark Carney in conversation with Mike Myers,
Right.
it was funny, it was humorous. Politically speaking, it was quite smart. But it ending with will there always be a Canada? Yes, there will always be a Canada. Like, no, there isn't always going to be a Canada, or what Canada becomes could be drastically different than what we think of. And in fact, it's always in the process of becoming the next thing that it will be. That's one thing that the people in that trucker convoy understood, was that they wanted to grab control of what this country means and what the nation means and tell a different story about it. And if we pretend that Canada is a just so story that we don't have to engage with in that way, then somebody else will take control of that narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The notion that, I mean, we're still a young country, as the state of Canada. Turtle Island is not young.
Mhm.
But there will always be possibilities, for it to change in any way. It will change. We know, if we look at history, places change. Who populates them changes. Whether how they classify their government system changes. Change is inevitable, and we have the opportunity to uh, build a better version of the nation that has been built here. Um, I mean, that nation, yeah, it could change altogether as far as its existence, in all of the possibilities. But there are good possibilities.
And
Um,
to wrap right back around to something you talked about in the introduction, Sandra, when an empire or a state refuses to change, you get things like the Ottoman Empire, you get the collapse. And well, I'm all in favor generally of dismantling empires. Collapse hurts a lot of people. So we've got a choice between either digging in our heels and refusing to change, and doing so under the knowledge that that means that there's really bad consequences coming down the line for us, or to understand that change is necessary and inevitable, and to get on with the business of trying to do it. As Emma always ends a lot of her talks with, is saying, let's get to work. We've got a lot we need to do to make these changes happen that need to happen.
And maybe this is, what we hope we can call each other in on, the settler folks, newcomer folks in Canada coming this Canada Day, is to get passionate about how good could it be? How good could it be if we regenerated just relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities? We learned from those ways of living. We considered the ways of how do we create good life for lots of people on these lands that goes forward into the future. Adam and I were spending time in Toronto in the last couple of weeks, and we saw the skies turning orange from the haze of wildfires that are happening in across the prairies. And these are happening because of settler decisions and settler choices around environmental management. They're happening because of climate crisis. And so if you're not motivated by the good arguments, then I hope that maybe people will be motivated by being brought a little more face to face with the impacts of our actions as nations and as peoples. And this is an opportunity. We are consistently being presented with opportunities to collaborate, to learn, to do better, to do differently by Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island and on these lands. There's so much information, there's so much scope to change what you're doing at the personal level, in your family, in your workplace, in your community. So yeah, let's get to work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly it. We have these opportunities to learn better ways, to relate to the land, to each other, um, to actually come to a point where, if we're still celebrating Canada Day down the road, that we can be genuinely proud of the nation that this is and what that stands for everyone in it, but most especially the people whose land it is, always has been, and always will be all along.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, I wanted to very briefly say hello to our friend Michelle in the comments, who's a question about the Nishka agreement and how that fits with treaties. I don't think we have time to get into a real detailed discussion of it, but I would encourage everybody to look into the history of the treaties of the lands that they're on and understand how many things that we call treaties are treated by the government as land surrender agreements, and that's part of the fundamental dishonesty about how we relate to these lands and people as transactional rather than the example of the two row as an ongoing relationship. That, we're talking about finality here, which is refusing to change, which is putting an end to things. Whereas what we're talking about is working together in dynamism going forward.
And to take us back to something Adam was saying before, to remember that when these modern treaties, which are sometimes more land surrender agreements, are making progress or being agreed, that is because of the unceasing work of Indigenous experts, activists, community members who have pushed this country into forcing them into some recognition and into some action. And so even with these agreements, they are imperfect, they're problematic, they still they represent something important. And I never want that labor and that effort to go by the wayside. Absolutely. And choosing not to celebrate Canada Day. What else can you do with your day and your time? Folks, got some ideas for you.
Right? Please don't cringe at me. I'm just gonna this time with a title and your names, share this book again. For any settler looking to educate themselves on what it means to be a settler, I cannot recommend a better source than this. We're at the end of an hour that went by so quickly. I cannot personally wait to have more conversations with the two of you on this subject. But with that, we should let our audience go. So thank you for joining us. If you joined us live today, if you're watching this on YouTube in the future, I hope the future is nice. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at our next NCTR Dialogue. Bye for now.